The beacon pulsed once. Then the silence of 3 million years shattered across every frequency in the galaxy. It lasted less than a heartbeat, that pulse, but the moment it touched the void, ancient monitoring stations dormant since the last cycle of stars woke screaming. Deep space listening posts in 17,000 systems registered the signal simultaneously, a single impossible note of quantum resonance that should not exist, could not exist, because it was tuned to a species that had been erased from memory and myth. In the Ketharan High Senate, the eternal speaker stopped mid-decree, tendrils going pale as the data flooded his neural link. Across the table, the Obsidian Concord's war diplomats froze, their threat analysis matrices spinning into overload. On the fringe worlds, old scavengers and forgotten dig clans looked up from their salvage with a dread they had no name for, only a bone-deep instinct that something terrible had just woken up. And in a crumbling ruin on a nameless rock, the woman who had triggered it all stood with her hand still pressed to the activation seal, not yet understanding that she had just lit a fire that would burn the galaxy to ash. Her name was Kira Venn. She was a xenoarchaeologist of the third caste, an outcast even among the dust-chasing relic hunters who scraped a living from the bones of dead civilizations. The ruin she had been excavating was worthless, a forgotten outpost from the Second Expansion era, covered in corrosion and silence. No one had expected to find anything. Certainly not a sealed chamber carved from a material that absorbed every known form of energy, and at its center, a perfectly smooth sphere of absolute black, floating a meter above a pedestal etched with symbols so old they predated every language the galaxy had ever spoken. She had touched it because she was desperate. Because her funding was gone, her reputation was dust, and the only thing she had left was a theory that the galaxy's oldest myths might not be myths at all. And now the sphere was glowing with a soft amber light, humming a frequency that resonated in her teeth, and the symbols on the pedestal were rewriting themselves into something she could suddenly read, as if the knowledge was being poured directly into her mind. It was a name. The name was not a word. It was a concept wrapped in terror, a forbidden utterance that had been purged from every archive, every database, every historical record in the galaxy for 100,000 years. It was a myth that mothers whispered to children to make them behave, a monster story that scholars dismissed as superstition, a ghost that haunted the nightmares of the oldest living species. Human, Kira staggered back, her hand breaking contact with the sphere. The humming stopped. The amber light died, but the name stayed in her head, burning cold, and somewhere in the distance, she heard a sound that made her blood freeze. The beacon had answered itself. She had not expected a reply. No one had ever expected a reply because the beacons, if the legends were true, had been silent since the Slaughter Age, 3 million years ago, when the first ones had burned the galaxy clean of something they refused to name. The myth said the humans had been wiped out, utterly and forever, erased so completely that not even their genetic code remained. It was the one thing every galactic civilization agreed on. Whatever the humans had been, they were gone, and the galaxy was safer for it. But the signal that now screamed back through the void was not the echo of a dead race. It was a response, deliberate, precise, and it was coming from a region of space that was supposed to be empty, the great anomaly, a wound in the fabric of reality that no ship had ever crossed and returned. The moment Kira's beacon activated, the galaxy's power structure began to crack. The Ketharan High Senate declared an emergency session, their ancient protocols triggering for the first time in 40,000 years. The Obsidian Concord, a military alliance of 17 apex predator species, mobilized their fleets without waiting for debate. They understood what was coming better than anyone because they were the inheritors of the Slaughter Age's victors. Their genetic memory, encoded into their very cells, remembered the humans, not as a myth, but as a nightmare they had sworn to forget. On the capital world of Kethara, the Eternal Speaker addressed the panicked assembly with a single image projected across the dome, the pulse pattern of the beacon, analyzed and translated. It was a sequence of coordinates and a message so simple that it paralyzed every species who heard it. Come home, 2 words, spoken in a language that had not been used since the galaxy was young. And beneath those words, layered into the subharmonic frequencies, a secondary message that only the most advanced decryption algorithms could detect. A countdown ticking slowly backward from a number no one could interpret. 24 cycles, Ketharan standard. Whatever was coming, it would arrive in 24 cycles. Kira ran. She ran from the ruin, from the dead moon, from the beacon that she now understood was not a memorial, it was a doorbell. Her small scavenger ship, the Dust Runner, was still parked on the surface, engines cold. She threw herself into the pilot's seat, hands shaking as she initiated the startup sequence. The console flickered with a dozen alerts she had never seen before, unidentified signatures, gravitational distortions, a massive object emerging from the anomaly's event horizon, moving faster than physics allowed. The galaxy's most feared myth was coming home, and it was answering her call. She broke orbit just as the first military ships arrived. Ketharan interceptors, sleek and silver, their particle lances already hot. They did not hail her. They did not warn her. They opened fire the moment she cleared the moon's gravity well, and Kira understood with sudden, terrible clarity that she was not going to be arrested or questioned. She was going to be erased, just like the humans had been erased, because the galaxy had spent 3 million years pretending that nothing existed beyond their carefully curated history. The first volley skimmed her port shields, sending the Dust Runner spinning. Alarms screamed. Kira fought the controls, her mind racing. She was no pilot, no soldier. She was an archaeologist with a half-broken ship and a head full of forbidden knowledge. But in the seconds before the second volley hit, something happened that no one in the galaxy could have predicted. The beacon spoke again, not a pulse this time, a voice. It filled every frequency, every channel, every neural link, every receiver in the entire star system. It was not the voice of a machine. It was the voice of something vast and ancient and absolutely furious, and it spoke in a language that bypassed translation entirely, imprinting meaning directly into the mind of every sentient being within 100 light years. She is under our protection. Ketharan interceptors stopped dead. Their weapons cooled. Their pilots, highly trained killers with centuries of combat experience, found themselves unable to move, their nervous systems locked by a primal terror that reached back through their evolutionary chain to a time when something else had ruled the stars. Kira's ship stabilized. On her view screen, a new signal appeared, a navigational route, clean and precise, leading deep into the uncharted void where no one had dared travel since the Slaughter Age. It was an invitation, or a command. She did not know which, and in that moment she did not care. Her home, her career, her very existence had just been incinerated by the fear of a galactic empire. She had only one choice left. She followed the signal. The journey took 11 cycles. 11 cycles of silence, of endless starfields, of a creeping dread that grew heavier with every light year. The beacon's route took her through regions of space that had been quarantined for millennia, past dead worlds that had once been thriving colonies before something had scoured them clean. She saw orbital graveyards filled with ships of designs no living species could identify. She passed a shattered planet, cracked open like an egg, its molten core still glowing with residual heat from a weapon that should have been impossible. And all the while, the countdown ticked lower. Behind her, the galaxy was tearing itself apart. The Obsidian Concord had seized the beacon system and quarantined the entire sector. News of the signal's content had leaked, impossible to contain when it had been broadcast to every mind in range, and panic spread like a plague. Religious cults rose overnight, proclaiming the return of the creators. Doomsayers filled the networks with apocalyptic visions. Governments collapsed on a dozen worlds as civil unrest erupted over the revelation that the galaxy's greatest enemy had not been destroyed, only sleeping. But it was worse than they knew, because the beacon was not alone. Deep space scans, now that the galaxy was actively looking, began detecting more of them, buried in asteroids, floating in nebulas, hidden beneath the foundations of cities that had stood for 100,000 years. Every single one had been dormant, invisible, until Kira Venn had touched the first. Now they were activating one by one, lighting up across the galactic plane like a constellation of funeral pyres. And each one broadcast the same signal, the same countdown, the same 2 words: come home. The Concord's War Council convened in secret. The 17 apex species, the inheritors of the Slaughter Age victory, faced each other across a table carved from the bones of a creature they had collectively driven to extinction. The Supreme War Coordinator, a member of the ancient and predatory Zoltari, presented the unthinkable. The beacons were not a distress call. They were not a weapon. They were a summoning network designed to activate under very specific conditions. And those conditions, according to the oldest records the Concord possessed, were supposed to be impossible: the presence of a living human, The myth said the humans were dead, every last one of them. The genetic purges of the Slaughter Age had been absolute, the sterilization protocols flawless, but the Concord had never been certain. Deep in their archives, buried beneath layers of security so old that no one remembered the passwords, there was a file, a single file. It contained a contingency plan, written in the final days of the war by the species who had barely survived. It was titled The Hidden Seed. The plan was simple. In the final hour, when the humans realized they could not win, they had not surrendered. They had hidden, not in bunkers, not in stasis, not in some distant galaxy. They had hidden inside the enemy. They had altered their own genetic code into a dormant carrier state, scattering it across 1,000 worlds, infecting the very species who had sworn to destroy them. The Slaughter Age had not ended the humans. It had spread them. Every species in the galaxy now carried fragments of human DNA, passed down through millions of years of evolution, waiting to be activated by a trigger that no one had ever found. Until Kira Venn touched a black sphere and her genetic code lit up like a supernova, she was the trigger. The Concord's analysis confirmed it within hours of the revelation. Kira Venn was not just a random archaeologist. She was the culmination of an evolutionary chain that had been carefully, silently guided across eons. Her blood, her cells, her very existence was the key that the human ancients had designed to unlock their return. And now the lock was open. The War Council erupted. Some demanded her immediate execution, a targeted strike on her fleeing ship before she could reach whatever was waiting in the void. Others argued for negotiation, for containment, for understanding what they were truly facing. But the debate was cut short by a new development that silenced even the most aggressive voices. The countdown had changed. It was no longer counting down to an arrival. It was counting down to a transformation. The signal was no longer just a homing beacon. It was a catalyst. Every fragment of human DNA in the galaxy, in every living creature, was beginning to activate. Random individuals across 100 species were experiencing spontaneous changes, heightened intelligence, regenerative abilities, memories that did not belong to them. The first reports came from the fringe worlds, dismissed as mutations or hoaxes. Then it spread. A Ketharan diplomat suddenly spoke a language that had been dead for 3 million years. A Zoltari warrior grew a new limb, perfectly formed, in a matter of hours. A child on a backwater colony opened her eyes one morning and saw the universe in colors no one had ever named. The galaxy was not being invaded. It was being awakened, and at the heart of it, Kira Venn flew deeper into the void, feeling the changes in her own body accelerate. Her thoughts were faster, her senses sharper. She could hear the hum of the ship's engines as music. She could see the gravitational currents of space like rivers of light. She was becoming something else, something that the ancient humans had designed her to become, and it terrified her even as it exhilarated her. On the 11th cycle, she reached the anomaly. It was not a wound in space. It was a door, a structure of impossible scale hung in the void, a ring of pure darkness surrounded by a halo of frozen light. It was larger than a star system, its geometry folding in ways that her newly enhanced mind could almost but not quite comprehend. The signal had led her here, to the threshold of whatever lay beyond. And as her ship drifted closer, the voice that had protected her spoke again, this time directly to her mind. Gentle and ancient, and filled with a sorrow that made her chest ache. "Welcome home, daughter. We have waited so long for you to find us." The ring began to pulse. The darkness within it rippled, and from the other side they came, not ships, not weapons, not the monsters of myth. They were beautiful, massive, luminous beings of pure energy and consciousness, their forms shifting like auroras in slow motion. They moved through the void as if it were water, surrounding her ship in a silent embrace. And Kira understood, in a flood of knowledge that poured into her mind from the beacon network, what the Slaughter Age had truly been. The humans had never been the victims. They had never been the enemy. They had been the gardeners. 3 million years ago, the galaxy had been a barren wasteland, lifeless and empty. The humans, the first ones, had seeded it with the building blocks of life, nurturing its development across millions of worlds. They had guided the evolution of countless species, cultivating intelligence and civilization like a grand experiment. But the experiment had gone wrong. The younger species had grown fearful, then hostile, then genocidal. They had turned on their creators, and in their fear, they had rewritten history to cast themselves as the heroes and the humans as the monsters. The Slaughter Age was not humanity's extinction. It was humanity's retreat. They had not been killed. They had left, withdrawing beyond the anomaly to a dimension where time flowed differently, waiting for the day their children would grow wise enough to seek them out without fear. The beacons were not weapons. They were invitations, left behind for the moment when a single soul would be brave enough to question the myths and seek the truth. And Kira, the outcast, the failure, the desperate archaeologist, had been the first, but the truth was more complex than even that revelation. As the luminous beings guided her ship through the ring into the impossible realm beyond, Kira felt the weight of their collective consciousness press against her mind. They showed her what waited on the other side of the countdown. The transformation was not a gentle awakening. The human DNA scattered across the galaxy was not just a dormant legacy, it was a failsafe. If the galaxy's civilizations continued on their current path of fear and violence, the full activation would not result in enlightenment. It would result in a purge, a reset, a return to the beginning. The humans had created a garden. If the garden became a wasteland, they would burn it clean and start again. The countdown was not to their arrival. It was to the decision point. And the decision rested not with the humans, but with the galaxy's leaders, who were even now debating whether to launch an all-out assault on the anomaly. Kira found herself standing, if standing was the right word, in a vast chamber of light, surrounded by the ancient humans in their true forms. They spoke to her without words, their thoughts layering into her consciousness like pages of a book. "You are the bridge," they told her, "the first of the awakened. The one who carries our voice back to the children we have loved for 3 million years. You must make them understand. If they choose war, the cycle begins again. If they choose peace, the garden will bloom." Kira felt the crushing weight of that responsibility settle onto her shoulders. She was an archaeologist, a nobody, a person who had spent her life scraping dirt from dead cities. And now she was being asked to speak for the most powerful beings in existence, to negotiate a peace that would determine the fate of every living thing in the galaxy. She wanted to refuse. She wanted to scream. But the ancient humans showed her one final image, and it broke her. They showed her the future that would unfold if she failed. A fire sweeping across the stars, world after world consumed in a cleansing that would leave nothing behind but silence and cooling ash. And then, after another million years, new seeds, new life, new civilizations that would grow and eventually face the same choice over and over until one of them got it right. This was not the first cycle. It was the 712th. The galaxy had been burned clean 711 times before. The truth of that crashed into Kira like a physical blow. All the civilizations, all the wars, all the history she had studied, it was just the latest layer of paint on a canvas that had been repainted more times than she could comprehend. The myths of the Slaughter Age were just the most recent retelling of a story that had played out again and again, ever since the first garden had been planted in the dark of the void. And every single time, the choice had been war. The luminous beings receded, and Kira found herself back on her ship, the ring shrinking behind her. She was moving again, this time toward the heart of galactic power, the Ketharan High Senate itself. The ancient humans had given her a deadline and a message, and they had given her the authority to speak in their name. But they had also given her a warning. If the galaxy's leaders fired a single weapon at the anomaly, the countdown would end instantly and the reset would begin. The choice was absolute. There would be no negotiation, no second chances, no appeals. She had less than a cycle to reach them. The Ketharan High Senate was in chaos when she arrived. Her ship, battered and scarred, dropped out of jump space directly into the heart of the capital system, surrounded instantly by the massed fleets of the Concord. Every weapon in the system locked onto her vessel. Every tactical officer waited for the order to fire. And Kira, her voice amplified by the same ancient technology that had protected her before, broadcast a single demand to every frequency. "I am the voice of the first ones. I carry their final message. Let me speak, or everything you know will end." Silence that followed was the most terrifying moment of her life. Then the eternal speaker, ancient and trembling, ordered the fleets to stand down. Kira Venn was escorted to the Senate chamber under the eyes of 1 billion watchers. Her arrival broadcast lived to every world in the network. She walked into the heart of power, surrounded by the 17 apex species who had once sworn to destroy her kind, and she looked into their eyes and saw not hatred, but terror. They knew. They had always known. The Obsidian Concorde's archives had confirmed what she was going to say before she even opened her mouth. The genetic tests had proven it. Every single one of them carried the human seed, dormant but waiting. They were not the inheritors of a victory. They were the descendants of a crime, and the victims were now standing at the door, offering a choice. Kira spoke for what felt like hours. She told them the truth of the cycles, the gardens, the resets. She told them about the 711 civilizations that had risen and fallen before them, each one convinced of its own supremacy, each one burning itself to ash rather than accept that it was not the center of creation. She told them about the ancient humans, not as gods or monsters, but as gardeners who had waited longer than any mortal mind could comprehend for their children to grow up. And then she told them the choice, peace, and the galaxy would enter a new age. The human legacy would fully awaken, but gently guided, a blossoming of potential that would unite every species into a single thriving civilization. War and the garden would burn. The human DNA in their cells would not save them. It would consume them, turning their bodies into the instruments of their own destruction. The Senate chamber erupted. Accusations flew, demands for proof, for time, for alternatives. But the countdown was now visible in the sky above the capital world, a number burning in the void like a second sun, ticking relentlessly towards zero. And as the arguments raged, a faction within the Concorde made a choice of their own. The Zoltari, the apex predators who had dominated the War Council for millennia, could not accept a universe in which they were not the supreme power. They believed the ancient humans were bluffing. They believed their own genetic modifications, honed over thousands of generations, could resist the activation signal. They believed they could win because they had won before in every cycle that had come before this one. They launched a strike. A single Zoltari battle cruiser, operating under sealed orders, fired a forbidden weapon, a dimensional destabilizer designed to collapse the anomaly into a singularity. The projectile crossed light years in seconds, faster than any countermeasure could intercept. It struck the ring at the heart of the void. And the ring absorbed it. The countdown stopped. For one eternal second, the galaxy held its breath. Then the voice of the ancient humans spoke, not to Kira, not to the Senate, but to every mind everywhere, and the sadness in it was more terrible than any threat. 712 cycles. You have chosen war again, but this time we will not burn the garden. We will let it choose for itself. The ring did not collapse. It expanded. A wave of light erupted from the anomaly, sweeping across the galaxy at speeds that violated every law of physics. It passed through stars, through planets, through ships and stations and living beings. And everywhere it touched, something shifted. The dormant human DNA in every creature, in every species, activated completely, not as a weapon, but as a mirror. Every sentient mind in the galaxy was flooded with the memories of the previous cycles. They saw the gardens that had come before, the civilizations that had risen to glory and fallen to ash. They saw the choices that had been made, the fears that had driven them, the wars that had consumed them. They saw themselves reflected 711 times, making the same mistakes, believing the same lies, dying the same deaths. And they saw the truth that the ancients had hidden even from Kira. The humans were not a separate species. They were the original form. Every living thing in the galaxy was a fragment of a single, ancient consciousness that had divided itself to experience existence in infinite forms. The garden was not an experiment. It was a dream. And the dreamer had been waiting, patiently, for its dream selves to remember who they were. The awakening was not an invasion. It was a remembering. Kira felt it happen inside her own mind. The walls of her identity, the boundaries that had defined her as a separate being, dissolved into a vast ocean of awareness that contained every life, every experience, every joy and sorrow that had ever existed in the galaxy. She was Kira Venn. She was also the eternal speaker. She was the Zoltari warrior who had fired the weapon. She was the child on the backwater colony. She was the ancient human waiting at the gate. She was all of them, and all of them were her. And in that moment, the choice became clear. There was no one to forgive. There was no one to blame. There was only the dream, and the dreamer finally waking up. The Zoltari commander who had ordered the strike felt the weight of 711 cycles of hatred and fear lift from his mind, replaced by an understanding so profound that he simply stopped. His ship, his weapons, his centuries of predatory instinct, all of it fell away, and he wept for the first time in his existence. Across the galaxy, wars ceased. Not because anyone commanded them to, but because the beings who were fighting suddenly understood that they were fighting themselves. The divisions that had fueled millennia of conflict, species, ideology, territory, dissolved into the recognition of a shared consciousness, a single life dreaming in countless forms. The ancient humans, the first ones, had never been gardeners or destroyers. They were the dreamer, and the galaxy was their dream. Every cycle of destruction had been a nightmare, a loop of fear that they had been trapped in for eons. And the beacon, the signal, the countdown, it had all been an alarm clock, designed to wake the dreamer before the nightmare could repeat. Kira Venn, the outcast, the failure, the desperate archaeologist, was the one who had pressed the button. Not because she was special, but because she was the part of the dream that had been brave enough to seek the truth, to touch the forbidden, to ask the question that no one else would ask. And the answer had been waiting for her all along. The final revelation came not as a voice, but as a feeling, a warmth that spread through the collective consciousness of the galaxy like dawn after an eternal night. The dreamer was awake, and the dreamer was not angry. The dreamer was not vengeful. The dreamer was simply glad to finally be home. The ring at the anomaly began to close, its purpose fulfilled. The countdown faded from the sky, replaced by a soft aurora that would remain visible from every world for 1,000 years, a reminder of the moment everything changed. The ancient human consciousness, no longer fragmented, began to weave itself back together, not to impose order, but to offer connection, a choice, always a choice, to remain part of the whole. Kira stood in the Senate chamber, surrounded by beings who had been her enemies and were now her siblings, and she felt the dreamer's joy like light in her veins. She had been so afraid for so long of being insignificant, of being forgotten, of being alone. And now she understood that she had never been any of those things. None of them had. She activated an ancient beacon, and the galaxy's most feared myth had answered. But the myth had never been a monster. It had been a mirror. And when the galaxy finally looked into it, they saw not a destroyer, but themselves, waiting to be remembered. The dreamer, at last, was whole, and the garden finally was at peace.